First, before we start talking about your recent book, so I want to ask you, so what inspired you to specialize on the Chinese economy?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. I was an exchange student in Thailand after my high school. And in Thailand, I became aware of the importance of China and Southeast Asia, and then became interested in China and started studying the Chinese language. And as a student of economics and politics, then increasingly became interested in China's economy. In particular, I was struck by the fact that when I was studying as an exchange student in China, that in China they were using more or less the same textbooks that we were using in Germany. So I was surprised how the economy could be working in such a different way, but nevertheless, the economics that was being taught at university was pretty much the same. So this is kind of what then sparked my interest in the role of economics in China's economy and reform process.
Now I will move to actually it's a very simple question, yeah. So, but a big one, an important one. So, what is actually shock therapy, and who are the economists behind the idea of shock therapy?
Yeah. So. On the first level, shock therapy is basically a package of different policies, a combination of rapid price liberalization, which is meant to be as quickly as possible, combined with macroeconomic stabilization, where macroeconomic restraint is meant to control the general price level. So you let go of all prices, but at the same time, you control monetary and fiscal policy tightly in hope that you wouldn't get inflation. And then this is meant to be combined with trade liberalization and privatization. But even the most committed shock therapists acknowledge that trade liberalization and privatization take some time. So the shocking element in shock therapy in the first instance is really the so-called Big Bang, which is a combination of price liberalization and macroeconomic austerity. Now, this being said, I think more broadly speaking, shock therapy is also a policy package that is based on the idea that a market economy emerges by destroying the planned system. So once you get rid of the old institutions, the market will be emerging more or less spontaneously. And it's kind of modeled on the standard textbook type of understanding of what markets are. That is, markets are the free movement of prices that happens in the interaction of private actors. So as such, this is a very uniform kind of idea of a market economy. And there's an assumption that you can create such a market economy no matter what the historical, cultural, material context is that you are facing. Now, this basic way of thinking about transition was quite prevalent. There are, of course, the most famous international names attached to this paradigm, such as Jeffrey Sachs. But this basic logic of assuming that you need to have a Big Bang in order to move from the old system to a new free market system emerged in all sorts of contexts, including in China, through exchanges with a wide range of economists.
I want to ask about the title of your book. So you use the word escaped, yeah, in the title of your book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy. So it's actually it's a normative word, so it implies actually something bad. So can you talk about your choice of this word, escaped?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. I mean, I start the book with a comparison with Russia. My point is not that Russia could necessarily have done exactly the same as China, but by comparing the different economic fates of these two gigantic countries, I'm trying to illustrate what was at stake in the early years of reform. And I'm also trying to illustrate that it was, throughout the book, that it was not a foregone conclusion that China would be rising and that China would be going through these decades of enormously high growth. So as such, the assumption in the book is that not doing shock therapy was critical for China's rise and was critical for the creation of the kind of reform approach that ultimately did propel China forward in terms of its economic growth and power in the world economy. So as such, not doing shock therapy is seen as the condition for the kind of reform approach that prevailed in China. And as such, I'm using the word escape, since not doing shock therapy would have prevented the kind of spectacular economic rise that we have observed.
So you mentioned the comparison between China and Russia. In your book, you are starting with a question actually that bothers many people. Yeah? How did China succeed when the former Soviet Union states, including Georgia, also faced economic stagnation, choosing the orthodox economics, shock treatment and the different paths. So, and it's not just actually how China did so well. It's actually also how did they get the confidence actually to choose the path they have chosen?
Yeah, confidence is an interesting way of framing it. I think that it's critical to realize that in the 80s in China, the first generation of revolutionary leaders, at least some of them, were still in power. I mean, someone like Deng Xiaoping would have been part of the very first guard of revolutionaries. So as such, the kind of constellation of personnel within China, I think, was quite different compared to the Soviet republics. And while there was a bursting open of the minds, and there was very in-depth engagement with all sorts of ideas and experiences from other countries, I think there was a commitment that whatever reform was going to do, it should not risk the stability of the rule of the Communist Party and the leadership of the state over the economy. So as such, I think this confidence in parts has to do with the kind of specific constellation that China was in the 1980s.
You mentioned actually that China learned how to make transition from total state-controlled economy to somehow market economy, and you used the gradualism, rather than shock treatment. Could you tell to our audience actually why in post-Soviet states the shock therapy became so popular, and are there also other examples rather than China where states chose gradualism, which actually today seems that it was the right way?
Yeah. I think that the appeal of shock therapy came from the difficulty of reform. So in Eastern Europe in particular, there had been attempts at reforming the socialist system for quite some time by the 1980s. And in fact, many of the Eastern European economists who visited China also were surprised when they saw the success of the agricultural reforms, since in their eyes, gradualism basically was a failure, and in their eyes, trying to change the economic system while maintaining the basic structures of the planned economy was basically a thing of impossibility. So they had arrived at the conclusion that in order to reform the system, you would have to take radical measures. So you couldn't be tinkering around, you couldn't be going with the dual track type of system that will basically maintain the state's control over the core of the planned economy and at the same time introduce market mechanisms, but that instead you had to go full out market, because otherwise you would be getting stuck in halfway type of transitions, which would be worse than the old system and worse than the market economy. So in that sense, I think there was an understanding that shock therapy was the only way out. So if you wanted reform, you had to go full in. If you did not go full-blown shock therapy, then you would get stuck and would be falling back into old habits. So I think this is the kind of thinking that underpinned the idea of shock therapy in many situations. Now, to your question, if there are other countries that pursued gradual reform, I'm not an expert on that question, but my sense is that Vietnam pursued some sort of a gradualist reform. However, Vietnam in the late 80s did have a relatively radical kind of price liberalization. But we have to remember that Vietnam in the late 1980s was an economy that was quite different from China. Half of Vietnam had been a market economy fairly recently. And the main challenge in market reform debates was how to introduce market mechanisms into the core of the urban industrial system, into the big, heavy industry type of conglomerates. And that situation in Vietnam, I think, was quite different. So Vietnam is an interesting case to look at.
Now I want actually to talk about important persons. So who were the Chinese intellectuals who had I would say responsibility of choosing gradualism or had a vision actually of how to do this? Yes, in your book you show actually how close Beijing came. Beijing was to adopting shock therapy in the 1980s, yes? And can you tell us more about the debates in 1980s? I remember you described these major debates of 1986. I think it's chapter 7 of your book. So can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, sure. So basically, two camps of market reformers emerged. There is, of course, some heterogeneity within the camps, but very broadly, simply speaking, two camps emerged. One camp very much emerged out of the experience of the agricultural reforms. This was more or less an alliance of older generation economic leaders who had decades of experience with economic policymaking, including during the Civil War, when the communists were fighting the nationalists and were gaining grounds by their tactics of economic warfare that allowed them to overcome hyperinflation, which was critical in gaining material ground, which was critical for their ultimate success. So these people had extensive experience with the use of markets towards political ends. And then there was a younger generation who had been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution and who returned to the cities in the late 1970s and basically started to enter universities. Some of them also started to enter research institutes. And they were still committed to the question of agricultural development and rural development. So as the agricultural reforms were starting to take off, they started to support this effort with systematic survey research across China, trying to understand how the bottom-up experiments that were popping up around the country could be systematized into an economic policy. So out of this type of situation, a reform group emerged that was situated, for example, at the Economic System Reform Research Institute, that basically argued that the dual-track reform that was emerging more or less organically could be turned into a mechanism for economic reform. On the other hand, there were middle-aged established economists who had been well-versed in Soviet economics in the 50s and 60s, who joined forces with also some older generation economists, as well as with young engineers and scientists, and were becoming more and more acquainted with neoclassical economics and the international mainstream economics of the time. And the second group started to argue that the dual-track system that was emerging in China would create friction and scope for corruption rather than solving the problem of introducing markets into China's planned economy. In 1986, Zhao Ziyang, who was then the prime minister, himself took initiative to set up the so-called program office, which was charged with designing a package reform, which was meant to draw up a plan for very far-ranging and fast price reform combined with wage and tax reform, which in terms of the basic kind of economics that it is built on, resembled some elements of the logic of shock therapy. So in 1986, these plans were already being drawn up, and those that opposed the idea of letting go of prices overnight and who thought that the dual-track experimentalist, gradualist approach should prevail, in this situation decided to go to Hungary and Yugoslavia, since on the side of those who were arguing for package reform, the experience of Eastern Europe was repeatedly invoked, and there was this same idea that I have just alluded to earlier, that gradualism must fail and that one must get stuck if one pursued gradualism. So therefore, one had to cut the ties between the planning institutions and the enterprises in order to create the conditions for a functioning market. So since Eastern Europe was this important reference in this debate, those who wanted to avoid shock therapy went to Hungary and Yugoslavia to understand what was going on the ground and whether the experience of Hungary and Yugoslavia really warranted that China should be implementing a package reform. And this delegation was composed of a number of people, including some of those who were actually involved in the program office, but also others who had been opposed to this logic all along, such as Chen Yizhi, Wang Xiaoqiang, and so on. So they sent back from Hungary and Yugoslavia the message that, quite to the contrary, rapid price liberalization could not solve China's problems, but instead, because China's enterprises were not actually market-oriented enterprises, but socialist production units, if you were to let go of prices, prices for raw materials that used to be artificially low in the planning system would be shooting up. And these enterprises would then hand down these price increases because they had a soft budget constraint, just as Kronay argued, whereas this price increase would then be handed down from producers of steel to producers of bicycles to the retail shop that was selling bicycles. And eventually workers would be demanding higher wages, since now the goods that they were buying would be priced at a higher cost. So therefore, they want that liberalizing prices in one big push would create hyperinflation, or at least a wage price spiral, without, however, solving the basic problem of adjusting relative prices and creating a functioning market economy. So as a result of these warnings, Zhao actually decided to turn around. Zhao had become acquainted with this group of economists through the agricultural reforms. Zhao himself, in many ways, became a top leader in China as a result of the success of the agricultural reforms. So he trusted the economists who were critical in the agricultural reforms and ultimately turned around and stopped the attempt at implementing a package reform that would have entailed very rapid price liberalization of key industrial goods in 1986. So this is in some sense the first escape from shock therapy in 86, where arguments by economists were really critical in shaping the path.
I will move now about roots of these economic reforms. Okay, so how important actually were memories of Western colonial influence, such as the Opium Wars or so-called unequal treaties, so for Chinese party officials in the late 70s and 80s. So actually, what role did this experience play in the perception of Western economic science and economic thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it links back to your question on confidence. So on both sides of the debate, there was a great fascination with Western economics, and there was a sense that China had to catch up with economic science internationally. So the divide between those two camps, on my mind, is not between those who were trying to use Western economics and those who rejected Western economics, but it was more a question of how to use Western economics. So those who ended up arguing for package reform basically were in the camp of one idea of a market economy that could be implemented with one kind of set of policies that was the result of one coherent way of modeling the market economy in accordance with the mainstream international economics at the time. On the other hand, those who were defending who were defending the dual track price system and gradualism also used techniques of research from Western social sciences, and also often actually used Western, if you want so, economics in making their arguments on, for example, price elasticities, inelasticity of supply, and so on. So it's not like they were arguing in terms that were completely unrelated to Western economics. In fact, they too had largely given up Marxist economics as their lens of analysis and had moved towards a more neoclassical type of analysis. However, they saw these economic forms of reasoning as tools that could be used in working out China's own approach, rather than as a coherent, complete model, which would provide a blueprint for what exactly China should be doing. Now, to link all of this to your question on colonialism in the 19th century, I think that there was a strong sense in the 80s of embracing the West, and also a great fascination with the West. And there was a slogan of so-called making up lessons from capitalism. So there was a sense that during the Cultural Revolution, China had gone too far in trying to revolutionize all social organizations, and that China now instead had to learn from the management and development techniques of capitalism in order to develop its material foundations. All of that being said, I think that not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly, there is a sense that China's fate is China's fate, and that China has to maintain economic sovereignty, and that at the end of the day, it's a responsibility of the Chinese leadership to carve out the way forward. And that as a result of the experience of the 19th century, and I mean, in many ways, the revolution itself was an anti-imperialist kind of project. I mean, a lot of the larger revolutionary ambitions were kind of fading by the 1980s, but I think the sense of national development was clearly a very dominant theme. So in that regard, the experience of the 19th century, I think more implicitly than explicitly, played a role in encouraging China's leadership to pursue its own path rather than to engage in some sort of wholesale copying from other countries. In fact, there was an acknowledgement that the wholesale copying from the Soviet Union had created large difficulties for China. So in the 1980s, the task was really to find a new kind of way that acknowledged China's specific position in the global economy and specific local conditions, rather than to hope that one big model could solve it all.
Also, one question about the roots. Do you think that China's this long history and so consolidated culture played a role in the successful transition process? Because you often mention the importance of Guanji, yes? It's a major compilation of philosophical, political and scientific writings dating back many centuries ago. So would you argue that maybe Confucianism played some role there?
Yeah, so in the book I am engaging in a whole chapter with China's tradition of statecraft. The point of this is not to say that we can explain the 1980s simply as a result of China's long history, since my argument is that in the 80s, China really came to the brink of implementing shock therapy, or at least elements of it, right? Key elements of it, not the whole package in the 80s, but key elements of it. So in that sense, my argument is that in the 1980s, this was really a crossroads, and it was a moment of decision, right? So in that sense, it was not simply predetermined by China's long history. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that from the perspective of China's long history, marketization is not by default the same as westernization, but instead China has a very long tradition of its own kind of marketization, and in fact has a very long tradition of a rather specific kind of state-market relations. So in the 80s, the big question of how to go about reform is ultimately also about the question of how the state can engage with the market economy, whether the state has to withdraw and make space for the market, or whether the state can act as an active market creator, can participate in markets, steer and shape markets. And this latter philosophy of the state as market participant is, of course, not unique to China. And in fact, I'm also engaging examples from the US and Europe where similar kind of logics appear. But it is prevalent in China nonetheless. And in the 1940s civil war, the communists, in fact, used techniques of such market creation, market participation in this critical moment that really laid the foundations for the founding of the People's Republic. So as such, I think it's important to recognize that in the ways of thinking about possibilities of how the state could engage with markets, China did have a distinct history that provided important context for what happened in the 80s.
You mentioned in this interview that so Chinese officials view the markets as a tool, yes. And when we look today, to United States or parts of Europe or the UK, we observe that this unregulated market results some social and gender inequality. So some problems in education, climate, racial segregation. And usually we see always that during the crisis, the state rescues the private sector. So what the West can learn actually from the experience of China? And I will add here also the question, could or should the Chinese model be emulated by other developing countries?
Yeah, so let me be clear that China's reform process has, of course, led to very deep marketization, and a lot of the ugly sides of marketization came along with this, right? You mentioned gender inequality, you mentioned climate change, and so on. In fact, in the early 90s, there was a debate in China around the question of whether China could pursue such an industry-intensive type of path of development, since if basically the kind of American style industrialization was upscaled to China's dimensions, this would basically push the world against the planetary limits. So in that sense, there was a debate in China, and on these questions, I think that marketization actually did have very problematic outcomes that China is trying to overcome as we speak. Now, what can the West learn from China? This is a great question. I think that in this moment that we are in, where the basic ideas of neoliberalism seem to be running out of steam and where there's a lot of debate around recreating the economic model, what we can learn from China is not copying China's approach to state market relations, but what we can take from China is a creative way of adapting different forms of state engagements with the market, which requires the hard work of trying to understand your own prevailing institutions, challenges, and material conditions, and then study the experiences of other countries, including China, and then come up with a way that uses some of these insights but tailors them to your own situation. So in that sense, I think that the last 40 years of China's reform can teach us a way of experimental adaptation and creation of new types of institutions, rather than providing us with a blueprint that could simply be taken from China and then implemented in other countries. I think this would be quite besides the point. And of course, the political situation is very different. The basic fabric of society is very different, and so on. I think the same goes for developing countries. I think that the positive message that comes out of China's experience is you should be thinking for yourself. You should not be assuming that there's one big model, be it the Washington or the Beijing consensus, that can simply be imported, implemented, and then like a magic bullet solve the riddle of development. But instead, that, and this is in some sense a challenging message, that economic growth from a position of relatively low levels of economic development, let's call it that, requires very hard continuous work in coming up with policies that try to take advantage of the specific existing local institutions, conditions, and so on, which I know is kind of a non-answer, but I think it stands more as a challenge rather than a solution.
So, and the last question. So, in your book, actually, you argue that China not only escaped shock therapy, but also it escaped binary thinking on shock therapy. Let's say yes, that free market is good and planned economy is bad. So, but this kind of binary thinking actually is still strong among many people, especially in post-Soviet states. So they suggest that China is successful because it became the champion of free market or market liberalization. So, but we see that the big Chinese state companies, yes, so-called the national champions, still exist, and we see that the states plays their enormous role in economy. So then my question is simple, actually. What can you tell to these people?
Not long ago, we had Barry Norton for a workshop at UMass. This is actually recorded on YouTube. And Barry was saying, in China, we have the paradox of more state, and in some sense even more plan, and more market at the same time. So through this state-guided kind of marketization, the market has become incredibly powerful, but at the same time, the state as a player in that market and using this market as a tool has also become more powerful, right? So in that sense, this is not a zero-sum kind of situation where more state means less market or more market means less state. At the same time, I think that this specific kind of marketization with this activist role of the state always left open the possibility of the state taking over parts of the private market, whereas at the same time, it left open the possibility of the private market becoming ever more powerful towards the state. So as a result of this, the 1980s market reform debate is kind of a path-breaking debate in the first decade of reform, but many of the points that are being discussed then are not over, right? You kind of have this tension between these two camps reoccurring. And if one takes this tension and these struggles seriously, then China's path is also not simply the result of one side, right? But rather it's like some sort of trench warfare, if you want so, where you always have two sides pushing, and then you kind of carve out a specific kind of constellation. So I guess that what can be taken from China is to break out of such a binary thinking of more state equal less market, or vice versa, as the main message here. So
thank you very much for an interview, for sharing your thoughts with us, and also thank you very much for writing this wonderful book. So thank you.